If you've ever felt invisible, like you could disappear and nobody would notice, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens in that forest will wreck you in the best way possible. And if this kind of story hits different for you, hit that subscribe button right now. There's more where this comes from. Chapter 1. She ran. Not from fear. Mara had stopped running from fear a long time ago. She ran because the sound she heard was a child, and a child alone in the Greyland forest at dusk was a child in trouble. She burst through the undergrowth, branches whipping across her arms, her herb satchel slamming against her hip. She nearly tripped over him. He was small, 6 years old, maybe 7. Curled at the base of a wide oak like he was trying to make himself part of it, knees pulled to his chest, both hands cupped around something she couldn't see. He was shaking, not violently, just that low, continuous tremble that comes when a child has been crying so long they've forgotten how to stop. Mara went still. She didn't reach for him. She didn't announce herself. She crouched down slowly, the way she'd learned to approach injured animals, and she waited until he felt her presence and looked up. His eyes were gray, red-rimmed from crying, but steady, the eyes of a child who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that he was not going to fall apart. She respected that immediately. "What's his name?" she asked. "The bird." He blinked, looked down at his cupped hands. The bird inside them was clearly dead, small brown thing, neck at the wrong angle. He'd been holding it anyway. "I didn't give him one yet," the boy said. His voice was rough from crying, but he was trying very hard to sound like that didn't matter. "Then let's give him one before we go," Mara said. He stared at her. "You're not going to tell me to put it down?" "No. Everyone always tells me to put things down." Mara looked at him steadily. "What do you want to name him?" The boy thought about it with the full seriousness that only children can bring to something the rest of the world has already dismissed. He looked at the bird for a long moment, then back at her. "Ash," he said. "Because he's gray and he doesn't move anymore." "Like Ash." "Ash is a good name," Mara said. She reached into her satchel and found the small square of cloth she used to wrap delicate roots. She held it out. He understood without being told. He placed Ash gently in the center and watched as she folded the edges over, slowly and carefully, like it mattered. Because it did. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Then he stood up and immediately swayed. She caught him. And that was when she smelled it, faint, metallic, with a sweetness underneath that sat wrong, like honey left too long in a warm place. She'd smelled it before, 3 years ago, when the midwife she served had treated a litter of pups in the eastern den. 2 of them hadn't made it through the week. The gray sickness. It was already in his blood. She picked him up without asking. He didn't protest, just leaned his head against her shoulder and held the wrapped bird against his chest with both hands. "I'm Kale," he said into her collar. Mara's steps didn't slow. But something in her chest went very quiet and very focused the way it did when she had already made a decision she knew was going to cost her. "I'm Mara," she said. "Are you taking me home?" "Yes." "My father is going to be angry." "At you or at me?" Kale considered this with remarkable honesty. "Probably both. But more at you." "Why more at me?" "Because you're unmarked," he said simply. Not cruelly, just stating a fact the way children state facts, without the mercy of softening. "Unmarked aren't supposed to touch us." Mara didn't answer that. She just walked faster. She had known the law her entire life. She had been born into it. No rank sent, no designation, no standing in pack courts. The unmarked existed at the margins of everything. They weren't outcast, weren't punished. They were simply invisible. Overlooked the way furniture is overlooked. Present, functional, unacknowledged. The law said an unmarked wolf who interfered with ranked business, especially involving pups, forfeited their life. No trial. No appeal. She had known all of that before she picked him up. She picked him up anyway. The border came into view as the last light was leaving the sky, a stone marker flanked by 2 torches, and beyond it, the outline of the pack's outer settlement. 2 soldiers stood watch. And behind them, a woman whose posture Mara recognized before she could see her face, shoulders squared, chin level, hand already resting on the blade at her hip. The beta. Sable. The soldiers raised their weapons the moment they saw Mara. She didn't stop walking. Halt, one of them said. Unmarked. Halt. Mara halted. She looked at Sable over the heads of both soldiers. Sable looked back at her, at the child in her arms, at the rank she didn't carry, at the absolute stillness on her face. He has the gray sickness, Mara said. Her voice didn't shake. I can smell it early stage, too, maybe 3 hours in. You have 6 hours before it reaches his lungs. After that, the survival rate drops by half. She paused. Do you want to argue about my rank, or do you want to save him? Nobody moved. Then Sable said, move. The healer's quarters smelled like pine resin and something sharper underneath, the kind of smell that meant people had been burning herbs in a hurry. Mara sat in the corner of the room on a wooden stool someone had shoved there without looking at her, and she watched 3 ranked healers work on Kale with the focused attention of someone who already knew more than they did. She didn't say that out loud. Kale had released her hand when they laid him on the table, but only because she'd told him to. She'd said, let them work, and he had looked at her with those steady gray eyes and obeyed, which told her more about him than an hour of conversation would have. He was a child who trusted carefully and completely. The kind of child who, once he decided you were safe, would follow you off a cliff. She didn't want to think about what that meant for the way this night was going to end. The door opened. She knew before she looked up. The room changed when he walked in, not dramatically, not the way stories describe it, with everyone snapping to attention and the air going electric. It was quieter than that. It was the way a room changes when the person everyone has been waiting for finally arrives and the waiting is over. Shoulders dropped. Breath released. The healers stepped back slightly without being asked. Aldrich Voss was not what she'd expected. She had heard the stories, obviously. Everyone in the Greylands had heard the stories. The warden who had held 3 rival packs under one authority through sheer force of will. The alpha who had buried his mate and come back to the war table the next morning because the pack couldn't afford his grief. Mara had constructed a version of him in her mind over the years, large, cold, the kind of man who had filed down everything soft in himself until only the weapon remained. He was large. She'd gotten that part right. But he stood at his son's bedside and put one hand very gently on Kale's forehead and closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that moment he looked like a man who was one wrong piece of news away from coming completely apart. Then he opened his eyes and looked across the table at her. She did not bow. She didn't do it from defiance, she simply didn't think of it. She was too busy reading his face, cataloging him the way she cataloged everything, looking for the thing underneath the thing. What she found surprised her. He wasn't angry. He was terrified, and the terror had nowhere to go, so it had organized itself into something that looked like control. She understood that. She'd done the same thing most of her life. You found him, he said. Not a question. Yes. In the forest. At the base of an oak, about 2 miles east of the border marker. He'd been there a while. Aldrich looked at his son. Kale was watching him with the careful attention of a child who was trying to gauge how much trouble he was in. Some other time, Mara thought, that calculation might have been funny. He has the gray sickness, Aldrich said. Yes. I identified it early. If I hadn't been there, she stopped. That wasn't the conversation to have right now. He needs the pine root compound, not the standard fever treatment. The standard treatment accelerates the progression. I've seen it happen. One of the healers looked up sharply. She's unmarked. She has no standing to direct treatment. Aldrich didn't look at the healer. He kept his eyes on Mara. Have you seen the gray sickness before? 3 years ago. Eastern Den. I was assisting the midwife. How many survived? 2 out of 5. The 2 that survived were treated with pine root compound. The 3 that didn't were given the standard fever treatment. She held his gaze. I'm not directing anything. I'm telling you what I saw. Silence. Then Aldrich said to the healer, pine root compound. The healer's jaw tightened, but he turned to prepare it. Mara let out a breath so carefully that no one heard it. She started to stand. She had done what she came to do. Kale was in ranked hands now. The smart thing was to leave before Sable remembered the law existed. But as she rose from the stool, Kale's eyes found her across the room. You're leaving. His voice was small. Not accusing, just the particular note of a child who has been left before and recognizes the shape of it happening again. Mara stopped. Your father is here, she said. You don't need me anymore. I want you to stay, Kale said. Then, after a pause, please. The word hit the room differently than it should have. An alpha son saying please to an unmarked woman in front of his father and his beta and 3 ranked healers. Nobody knew what to do with it. Mara looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at his son. Something moved across his face, too fast to name, gone before it fully formed. Then he looked at Mara and said nothing. He just didn't tell her to leave. She sat back down. Sable appeared in the doorway sometime after midnight, when the compound had been administered and Kale was sleeping with the shallow, rapid breathing of a body fighting hard. She looked at Mara on her stool in the corner. Then she looked at Aldrich, who had pulled a chair to his son's bedside and was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his eyes fixed on Kale's face. She's still here, Sable said quietly. I know, Aldrich said. The blood right. I know, Sable. It isn't a technicality. It's. I said I know. His voice was low and even, which was somehow more final than if he'd raised it. Not tonight. Sable looked at Mara one more time. Mara looked back at her without expression, without challenge, just the steady, patient look of someone who had long ago learned that other people's hostility was their own business. Sable left. The room settled into the particular silence of a sick room at night, the crackle of the fire, the soft movement of the healer checking Kale's temperature every hour, the sound of a father barely breathing while he watched his son fight. Mara sat in her corner and she waited. She was good at waiting. The Unmarked learned it early. You waited at the edges of everything. You waited to be seen, waited to be needed, waited for the moment when your invisibility became someone else's convenience. She had spent her whole life waiting, and she had made a kind of peace with it. But this felt different. This wasn't the passive waiting of the overlooked. This was a choice. She was choosing to stay. Every minute she remained in this room was a minute she was choosing, eyes open, rank law fully understood, consequences fully acknowledged to be here. Around the 3rd hour, Kale's fever spiked. It happened fast. One moment he was sleeping, the next he was making a sound low in his throat that brought every person in the room to their feet. The healer reached him first, pressed his hands to Kale's chest, and looked up at Aldrich with an expression that said what he wasn't going to say out loud. They were losing ground. Aldrich's hands closed around his son's. Kale. Kale, stay with me. Kale's eyes opened, glassy, too bright, the gray of them almost silver in the firelight. He turned his head slowly. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Mara. The story, he said. His voice was barely a thread. You said you'd tell me a story. Mara stood up. She crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She felt Aldrich's eyes on her, not hostile, not permissive, just watching, and she ignored them both and looked only at Kale. I did say that, she said. What kind of story do you want? One where something small wins, he whispered. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she began. Chapter 2. There was once a wolf, Mara said, no bigger than a heartbeat. Kale's eyes stayed on her face. His breathing was still too fast, still too shallow, but he was listening. That was enough for now. She had no pack, Mara continued. No rank. No name that anyone bothered to remember. She lived at the edge of the great forest where the old trees grow so tall they forget what the ground looks like. And every morning she woke up and the world told her she was nothing. And every morning she decided not to believe it. What did she do? Kale whispered. She learned things. Everything she could. The name of every plant, every root, every bark that could heal or harm. She learned to read weather in the way birds flew and illness in the way a body smelled. She made herself useful in every way the world told her she wasn't allowed to be important. Kale shifted slightly. His grip on Mara's hand tightened. Did she ever get a pack? He asked. Keep listening, Mara said. She kept her voice low and even, the rhythm of it steady and deliberate, and somewhere in the second telling, she felt the tension in Kale's small body begin to loosen, not fully, not the way it would if he were simply falling asleep, but the way a fist loosens when the thing it was braced against stops pushing back. She talked about the small wolf finding a bird with a broken wing. She talked about the bird being afraid and the wolf sitting beside it for 3 days without touching it, just being present, until the bird decided the wolf could be trusted. She watched Kale's face as she said it and saw the moment he understood she wasn't only talking about a wolf and a bird. His eyes got very bright. Not from the fever this time. Aldrich hadn't moved from his chair. Mara was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, a pressure at the edge of her attention, not threatening, just present. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Kale. Around the 4th hour, she ran out of story. She had taken the small wolf as far as she could through the forest, through the winter, through the moment the bird's wing healed and it flew for the first time, and the wolf watched it go without grief, because she had never tried to keep it. She brought the wolf to the edge of a great territory, standing at the border, unclaimed and unafraid. And then she stopped. The room was very quiet. Kale's breathing had slowed. Not dangerously, it had evened out, the rapid shallow flutter replaced by something steadier, deeper. The healer had crossed him twice in the last hour and retreated both times without intervening. Mara had noticed. She hadn't said anything. Is that the end? Kale asked. His voice was drowsy now, pulling towards sleep. It's a pause, Mara said. The best stories don't end. They just rest for a while. He almost smiled. She could see it trying to form at the corner of his mouth, too tired to fully arrive. Mara, he said. Yes. Don't go when I fall asleep. She looked at him for a long moment. The weight of what she was agreeing to settled over her clearly. She understood it, measured it, accepted it. I won't, she said. He was asleep within minutes. She sat with her hand in his and stared at the fire and listened to him breathe. She became aware, slowly, that the healer had stepped out, that the room had emptied of everyone except the two of them and the man sitting in the chair on the other side of the bed. She became aware that Aldrich was looking at her. She met his eyes across his sleeping son. The pine root compound is working, she said quietly, because the silence needed something in it. I know, he said. Another silence. The fire shifted. A log collapsed into embers and sent a brief wash of gold across the room. What was the bird's name? Aldrich asked. Mara blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that was not among them. The bird in the story, he said. You never named it. She looked at him steadily. Ash, she said. Something moved across Aldrich's face. He looked at his son. Then he looked back at her, and she could see him doing the mathematics, connecting it, understanding where she'd borrowed it from, realizing that she had taken his son's grief over a dead bird and woven it into something that gave Kale a reason to keep listening. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. She could see it in the way the hardness around his jaw shifted, just slightly, just enough. You should know, he said, that Sable will invoke the blood right in the morning. She isn't wrong to. The law is the law. I know, Mara said. You could leave now. Before morning. I wouldn't, he stopped. Started again. No one would stop you. Mara looked at Cale's sleeping face. At the slow rise and fall of his chest. At the small wrapped bundle of cloth still clutched in his free hand, Ash, the dead bird, held safe through a fever and a night that could have gone much worse. He asked me not to go when he fell asleep, she said. Aldrich was quiet. That's not a good enough reason to risk your life, he said finally. It is to me, she said simply. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and she was too tired for pretense. Whatever he saw, he saw. Why? He asked. Not aggressively. She would have known how to handle aggression. He asked it the way a man asks something he genuinely doesn't understand, with the honest bewilderment of someone whose world has just produced a thing it wasn't supposed to be able to produce. Because he named the bird, she said. Any child who stops being scared long enough to name something that is already dead, that child deserves someone to stay. Aldrich said nothing. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside the window the night was beginning its slow retreat toward gray, the darkness thinning at the edges. I had a name once, Mara said. She didn't know why she said it. She hadn't planned to. Before the designation. Before they looked at me and found nothing to measure. My mother named me after the river near where I was born. Mara. It means, in the old language it means. Enduring, Aldrich said quietly. She looked at him. He held her gaze. I know the old language, he said. My mate, he stopped. The word landed in the room, and he let it land, didn't flinch away from it. She used to translate the old texts. She told me what all the river names meant. A pause. Mara. The river that doesn't stop for seasons. The silence after that was different from the silences before it. It had more weight. More texture. It was the silence of two people who have unexpectedly shown each other something true. Mara looked back at the fire. You loved her, she said. Not a question. Completely, he said. No hesitation. No performance of stoicism. Just the plain word, placed down like a stone. Mara nodded slowly. She understood completely. She had watched enough grief in her work with a midwife to know the difference between a man who had moved past loss and a man who had simply built walls around it and was living in the space inside. Aldrich was the second kind. She didn't say that. It wasn't her place and it wasn't the time. But she filed it away in the part of her mind that noticed things, and she sat with it quietly as the night finished dying and the first gray light of morning began to press against the window. Cale slept through all of it. His breathing by dawn was almost normal, deep and slow and steady, the rhythm of a body that had fought hard and found its footing. The healer came back at first light, checked him thoroughly, and looked up at Aldrich with an expression that had changed considerably from the one he'd worn at midnight. The fever has broken, he said. He'll need rest. Weeks of it. The sickness has left some damage to his shifting capacity. We won't know the full extent until he's older and attempts a full shift. But he's past the worst of it. Aldrich closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough to absorb it. Then he opened them and Sable was in the doorway, and the look on her face said that the night was over and the morning had brought everything the night had held off. The blood right, Sable said. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was the voice of a woman who believed in what she was saying and took no pleasure in it. She's still here, Aldrich. She touched your son. She stayed in this room all night. I can't ignore it, and neither can you. Mara stood up. She let go of Cale's hand carefully, so as not to wake him. She straightened. She turned to face Sable across the room, and she was aware of Aldrich watching, and the healer watching, and the pale morning coming through the window behind her, and she thought, This is the moment. This is where it costs. I know the law, she said. Her voice was level. I knew it when I picked him up. I knew it every hour I stayed. She paused. I would do it again. Sable looked at her with something complicated moving behind her eyes. Not hatred. Something more uncomfortable than hatred, the expression of someone confronting a thing they can't neatly file away. That isn't a defense, Sable said. I know, Mara said. I'm not defending myself. I'm just telling you the truth. The room went very still. Aldrich stood up. It wasn't a dramatic movement. He didn't slam the chair back or raise his voice or fill the room with the kind of alpha energy that made walls shake. He simply stood, and the standing was enough. The healer took a quiet step backward. Sable's hand stilled at her side. Leave us, Aldrich said. Sable's eyes moved to Mara. Then back to him. Aldrich. Sable. Just her name. Nothing else. But the way he said it closed every door in the conversation. Sable left. The healer followed. The door shut behind them with a soft, final click, and Mara was alone in the room with Aldrich Voss and his sleeping son and the pale morning spreading itself across the floor between them. She waited. He didn't speak immediately. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the territory, the settlement coming awake below, smoke beginning to rise from campfires, the far line of the forest dark against a lightning sky. She watched the set of his shoulders and read them the way she read everything, carefully, without assumption, looking for the thing underneath the thing. He was not deciding whether to invoke the blood right. She could tell that much. He had already decided. The question she couldn't answer yet was which way. Tell me something, he said, still facing the window. In the eastern den. The 2 pups that survived, did you know they would survive? When you used the pine root compound, did you know? Mara considered the question honestly. No, she said. I knew the standard treatment was making them worse. I knew the compound had worked in 2 cases I'd read about in the midwife's records. I didn't know. I made the best decision I could with what I had. He turned from the window. That's what I do every day, he said. For an entire territory. With lives that number in the thousands. He looked at her steadily. And I have rank, bloodline, authority, an army, and a council of advisors. You had a herb satchel and a borrowed stool. Mara said nothing. I'm trying to understand you, he said. It came out almost frustrated, the confession of a man who prided himself on reading people and had met someone he couldn't file into an existing category. You're unmarked. You have every reason to keep your head down, stay invisible, let whatever happens happen. Instead, you run toward a child in a forest. You carry him through enemy territory. You correct my healers. You sit in this room all night knowing what morning would bring. He paused. Most ranked wolves with every advantage wouldn't have done what you did. Most ranked wolves didn't find him, Mara said simply. He looked at her. It isn't complicated, she said. He was alone and he was afraid and he had the sickness and I knew what it was. What was I supposed to do, walk past him because the law said I wasn't allowed to care? She shook her head. I've spent my whole life being told I don't exist. I decided a long time ago that I would act like I do, regardless of what anyone decided about my rank. The silence stretched between them. Aldrich had the kind of stillness that powerful men develop over years, a composed, deliberate stillness that was nothing like peace and everything like control. But something in it had shifted overnight. She could see it. Whatever wall he'd had up when he first walked into this room had developed a crack. She didn't know what was on the other side of the crack. She wasn't sure he did either. There's something else, he said. He crossed to the small table beside Kale's bed and picked up a piece of cloth, her cloth, the one she'd wrapped Ash in. He held it out. The healer found it when he was checking Kale's hands. He thought it was a wound dressing. He looked at her. It isn't. No, she said. A dead bird. His name is Ash. Something moved at the corner of Aldrich's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, surfacing briefly before he could suppress it. He set the cloth back down carefully, the same careful way she had folded it the night before, and she noticed that and filed it away. "Elder Rana wants to see you," he said. Mara blinked. That she hadn't expected. The pack historian? She was here at dawn. She heard. He paused. "She heard you in the night. The sound you were making." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "What was that?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "The Ashgal," she said. He frowned. "I don't know it. Most ranked wolves don't. It's old, older than the current pack laws, older than the warden title. The Unmarked kept it because we had no clan songs, no rank ceremonies, no formal ways to mark the important moments. The Ashgal was what we had. You sit with someone who is suffering and you hum continuously, without words, without stopping, so they know they are not alone in the dark." She paused. "It doesn't heal anything. It just says, I am here. I am not leaving. Whatever happens, you will not go through it alone." Aldrich was very still. "Kale's fever broke during it," he said. "The compound broke the fever," Mara said. "The Ashgal she searched for the right word. It just kept him calm enough for the compound to work. Fear accelerates the gray sickness. It feeds on distress. If I could keep him calm enough, still enough, the medicine had a better chance." "You knew that?" "Yes. And you didn't say anything. You just did it. Would you have let me if I'd asked permission?" He had no answer for that. They both knew it. A sound from the bed, small, like a catch of breath. They both turned. Kale was stirring, eyelids fluttering, hands tightening around the cloth bundle on his chest. He turned his head toward Mara's side of the bed first, instinctively, before he was even fully conscious. Then his eyes opened and found her still there, and the look on his face was so unguarded, so purely relieved, that Mara felt something in the back of her throat tighten. "You stayed," he said. "I said I would," she told him. He looked at his father then. Aldrich was watching his son with an expression he'd probably have removed from his face if he'd known it was there, something exposed and tender that had no business being on the face of the warden of the Greylands. "Am I in trouble?" Kale asked him. "Not right now," Aldrich said. "Is Mara in trouble?" A pause. "Not right now," he said again. Kale seemed to find this acceptable. He settled back against his pillow, still holding Ash against his chest. His eyes moved between the two of them with the particular alertness of a child who has been underestimated his whole life and misses nothing. "You two were talking," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "About me. Some of it." "What else?" "Old language," she said. "River names." Kale's brow furrowed with the exaggerated confusion of someone who found adults bewildering. "That's a strange thing to talk about." "Most true things are strange if you think about them too long," Mara said. Kale considered this deeply, the way he considered everything. Then he nodded as if she'd said something that made complete sense, and closed his eyes again. Mara stood and turned to find Elder Rana in the doorway. She was ancient in the way certain trees were ancient, not fragile, not diminished, just layered with more time than the things around her. She was small and sharp-eyed, and she was looking at Mara with an expression that was absolutely nothing like the expressions Mara was used to receiving from ranked wolves. She was looking at her with recognition. "You know the Ashgal," Rana said. "Yes, Elder." "Where did you learn it?" "The midwife I served." She said her mother taught her. "And her mother's mother before that." Rana nodded slowly. "It has been passed through the Unmarked for 6 generations. The ranked wolves let it go. They had other rituals, formal ones that came with ceremony and standing. They forgot this one." She paused, her sharp eyes moving briefly to Aldrich and back. "They forgot that the old code, not the current law, the founding code, the one this pack was built on before the rank designations existed, grants sacred protection to any wolf who performs the Ashgal over a life in danger. The room went absolutely still. Sable had come back to the doorway. Mara hadn't heard her return, but she was there now, standing with her arms folded, and the expression on her face was no longer the composed certainty it had been an hour ago. "Sacred protection," Sable said flatly. "From Bloodright." "From Bloodright," Rauna confirmed. Her voice was entirely pleasant. "It's not a technicality, Sable. It's foundational law. It predates everything you're citing by 4 centuries. She tilted her head. "Would you like me to show you the texts?" Sable's jaw was tight. "The Ashkal hasn't been performed in." "It was performed last night," Rauna said simply. "I heard it. The warden heard it. The healer heard it. Kale survived." She looked at Mara with that same look of recognition. "It was performed correctly, completely, and without interruption for 4 hours. The protection stands." Sable looked at Aldrich. Something was happening behind her eyes. Mara could see it, the place where a rigid thing begins to develop doubt. Not collapse. Not conversion. Just the first honest crack in a wall that had been built too solid for too long. "She still broke protocol," Sable said. Her voice had lost some of its certainty. "She still touched a seedling without." "She saved a seedling," Aldrich said. Everyone looked at him. He was standing at his son's bedside with his arms at his sides, and his voice was very quiet and very clear. "She found him alone in the forest with the gray sickness in his blood, and she carried him here, and she corrected my healers, and she sat in this room all night and performed a ritual that kept him calm enough for the compound to work." He paused. "She saved my son. You can question my judgment after the children stopped dying." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Not loudly. Not with ceremony. Just quietly and permanently, the way ground shifts after rain, everything in the same place, but nothing quite level anymore. If this story is hitting you right in the chest, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me what moment got you. And if you haven't liked this video yet, now is a good time. Chapter 3. 3 days passed. Kale slept through most of the first one. He ate through most of the second. By the third, he was sitting up in bed demanding to know the names of every herb in Mara's satchel, and she sat beside him and told him each one, the look, the smell, the use, the warning, with the patience of someone who had learned that teaching was its own kind of medicine. Aldrich came morning and evening. He didn't stay long either time. He would check on Kale, exchange a few words, and leave with the bearing of a man who had a territory to run and was running it. But Mara noticed that each time he left he paused at the door for just a moment, not looking back, just pausing before he went. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. On the third morning, Sable came alone. She stood in the doorway of the healer's quarters while Kale was sleeping and looked at Mara sitting in her usual corner with her satchel open across her knees, sorting roots. Mara looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Sable came inside and sat down across from her, and the straightness of her spine and the set of her shoulders said clearly that this was not easy, and she was doing it anyway. "I want to understand something," Sable said. "Ask," Mara said. "You knew the Ashkal. You knew it carried ancient protection. You could have invoked it the moment we found you at the border. You could have cited foundational law and made my weapons irrelevant before we even got through the gate." She paused. "Why didn't you?" Mara looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't pick him up to protect myself," she said. "I picked him up because he needed to be picked up. If I'd invoked the law at the border, it would have looked like strategy. Like I knew what I was doing and I did it for my own benefit." She shook her head. "I didn't want protection. I wanted him to get through the night." Sable was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands, then back at Mara. The composed certainty was still there, but it had a different quality now, not the certainty of someone who hasn't considered the alternative, but the harder, more honest certainty of someone who has considered it and is still finding their way through. "I don't think you're a threat," Sable said finally. "I want to be clear about that. My objection was never personal. I know, Mara said. The law exists for reasons. Good reasons. Ranked pups are targets, politically, militarily. And unmarked with access to a seedling is a vulnerability the pack can't afford to. I understand the law, Mara said. Not cutting her off, just saying it clearly. I grew up under it. I know exactly what it costs and who it costs and why it was written. I'm not arguing that it's wrong. She paused. I'm just telling you that there are moments when the law and the right thing point in different directions, and in those moments you have to choose which one you can live with. Sable looked at her for a long time. Which one can you live with? Mara asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, asked quietly, the way Mara asked everything, without theater, without pressure, just the plain shape of the thing laid out to be looked at. Sable didn't answer immediately. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and moved toward the door. Then she stopped. She didn't turn around. The Ashgal, she said. Does it work on adults? Mara blinked. Yes. My mother, Sable said. Just that. 2 words. Then she walked out. Mara sat very still for a moment, looking at the empty doorway. Then she looked down at her roots and continued sorting them, and she didn't say anything about that conversation to anyone. The news came on the 4th day like weather fast, from an unexpected direction, and with the particular coldness of something that had been building for a long time before anyone noticed the signs. 3 more pups. 2 in the southern den, 1 in the eastern territory. All with the gray sickness. All presenting within 12 hours of each other. The pack council was in emergency session before midday. Mara knew about it the way she knew about most things, not because anyone told her, but because she paid attention. She heard the urgency in the footsteps outside the healer's quarters. She saw the expression on the face of the ranked wolf who came to check on Kale and left faster than he arrived. She smelled the particular sharp anxiety that a pack under threat produces without knowing it. She was standing at the window thinking about it when Aldrich came in. He didn't go to Kale first this time. He came to her. You said the gray sickness has a plant-based origin, he said. No preamble. No softening. 3 more cases. Different dens, different water sources, different healers. The only common factor is timing. He looked at her. What do you know that my council doesn't? Mara turned from the window. How many sources has the pack tested? The primary river. 2 secondary streams. All clean. What about the salt licks? He stilled. The communal salt licks. The ones near the denning areas. Pups use them more than adults. They need the minerals during development. If someone wanted to target pups specifically and make it look like a natural outbreak, the salt licks are the delivery mechanism. She held his gaze. In the midwife's records there was 1 documented case of deliberate gray sickness transmission. It was through a salt lick. The record was old, 200 years. Most people have forgotten it exists. Aldrich looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. You read 200-year-old midwife records, he said. You don't need to. Lord Fenric has been challenging my authority for 2 years. He wants the warden title, and he wants it before the next council vote. If my territory is destabilized, if my pups are dying and my healers can't explain why, he stopped. His jaw tightened. He positioned himself as the solution before anyone knew there was a problem. He's been advocating for a new approach to gray sickness treatment for months. Something he conveniently developed. Mara looked at the salt lick. Then at Aldrich. There's something else, she said carefully. He looked at her. Kale didn't wander into that forest by accident, she said. The gray sickness takes hours to become symptomatic. He would have been exposed before he left pack territory. If someone had access to his routine, knew which paths he took, knew when he'd be alone. The silence that followed was absolute. Aldrich stood up slowly. When he turned to face her, his expression was controlled in the particular way of a man containing something enormous through sheer will. He was targeted, Aldrich said. I think so, Mara said. I think he was meant to be found sick and alone in the forest. I think the goal was to break you, not kill him necessarily, but break you. An alpha who can't protect his own blood loses the confidence of his pack. That's how you destabilize a warden without a direct challenge. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was cold and flat, and it showed everything, the exhaustion under his composure, the grief that was always there just behind the governance, and something new that she hadn't seen before. Something that looked, despite everything, like gratitude. "You saved him," he said. It came out differently this time than it had in the healer's room. Quieter. More private. Not just medically. "You saved him before we even knew he needed saving. If you hadn't been in that forest." "I was," Mara said. "If you hadn't been." "Aldrich." She said his name for the first time. It stopped him. She met his eyes and held them. "I was." That's what matters. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold morning light, beside a poison salt lick in a territory that someone had tried to break, and something shifted in his face that she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized in the way you recognize a change of season. Not by one thing, but by everything at once. "Come on," he said quietly. "We have work to do." The tribunal convened 5 days later. The great hall of the Greylands pack house was the kind of room that had absorbed centuries of decisions, the stone walls thick with it, the long table scarred from generations of fists and arguments, and the particular violence of powerful people disagreeing. Every clan chief sat at that table. Every ranked wolf of standing was present. The air was tight with the specific tension of people who had come expecting to watch something be decided and weren't entirely sure which way it would fall. Mara stood at one end of the room and did not sit because she had not been offered a seat and she would not ask for one. Lord Fenric sat at the far end. He was a large man with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was argument, everything about him polished, composed, radiating the particular confidence of a person who has prepared for this moment and believes preparation is the same as winning. He had brought his own counsel. He had brought witnesses. He had brought a stack of documents that he kept touching with the tips of his fingers the way people touch things they believe will save them. He had not brought an explanation for the Greyleaf extract. Aldrich presented the evidence without theater. That was what struck Mara most, watching him work. No performance, no manipulation of the room's emotions. Just the facts laid out in sequence, each one placed down cleanly, the way you lay stones across a river. The contaminated salt licks. The Greyleaf compound. The altitude-specific plant source to the eastern ridge, Fenric's territory. The coordinated timing across 3 dens. The record showing Fenric's healers had purchased concentrated Greyleaf extract in quantities that had no medicinal justification. And then, last, the oldest midwife record, 200 years old, pulled from a library that no ranked wolf had visited in living memory, documenting the only previous case of deliberate gray sickness transmission. Same compound. Same method. Same target population. Fenric's composure held through most of it. It cracked at the midwife record. Mara watched it crack, the small tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in how he was holding his shoulders, and she knew that he hadn't known that record existed. He had thought the method was buried deep enough to be safe. He had not accounted for a woman with too much time and access to libraries. "This is conjecture," Fenric said. His voice was still even. "A collection of circumstantial evidence assembled by," he paused, and looked at Mara with the first open contempt he'd allowed himself. "Assembled by an unmarked woman with no rank, no standing, and a personal interest in currying favor with the warden." The room shifted. Not dramatically, just that subtle realignment of attention that happens when something has been said that everyone will remember. Aldrich didn't look at Fenric. He looked at Elder Rauna. Rauna stood slowly, with the unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to rush, because time has long since learned to wait for her. She placed 3 documents on the table. She named each source. She explained each connection. She spoke for 11 minutes in a voice so clear and so level that the room was completely silent for all of it. When she finished, she looked at Fenric and said, "The evidence is not conjecture. The woman who found it is not on trial. You are." Fenric looked around the table. He was reading faces. Mara could see him doing it, looking for the allies he'd spent 2 years cultivating, the chiefs who owed him favors, the ranked wolves who'd nodded along to his challenges against Aldrich in private rooms. He was looking for the network he'd built. He found Sable. Sable was looking back at him with an expression that was entirely neutral. Not hostile. Not apologetic. Just the clear, steady look of someone who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Fenric understood what that meant. Mara watched him understand it. The vote was not close. He was stripped of his chieftaincy before midday. His territory placed under council oversight. His allies quietly distancing themselves before the session had even formally closed, the way allies do when the wind changes, not dramatically, just suddenly, completely, and without acknowledgement that they were ever standing where they were standing. Mara watched it all from her position at the end of the room and felt nothing triumphant about any of it. 3 pups were still sick. Kale still had damage to his shifting capacity that might never fully resolve. Aldrich still carried his grief like a stone under his ribs. None of that was fixed by Fenric's removal. Justice wasn't the same as healing, and she had never confused the two. After the session ended and the hall emptied, she was the last one left at the far end of the room. She was looking at the long scarred table and thinking about nothing in particular when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Sable crossing toward her. Sable stopped a few feet away. She stood straight, as she always did, as she probably always would. But something in her face was different from every previous version of her face that Mara had catalogued. It was open. Just slightly. Just enough. "My mother," Sable said. "She's been declining for 2 months. The ranked healers say there's nothing more to be done." She paused. "Would you?" Another pause. The straightness of her spine said this was costing her, and she was paying it anyway. "Would you be willing to sit with her?" Mara looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. Sable nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. She turned back. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who is about to say something they have been composing for several days and wants to get it exactly right. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about the law. The law is what it is, and I'll defend it as long as it serves this pack. But I was wrong about you." She paused. "You were never a threat. You were the only person in the Greylands that night who did exactly what they should have done, exactly when they should have done it, without anyone telling them to." She paused again. "That's rarer than rank." Mara held her gaze. "Thank you," she said. It was enough. They both knew it was enough. Sable left and Mara stood alone in the empty hall and let the silence settle around her and breathed it in. The tethering happened at dusk. Not in the great hall. Aldrich chose the courtyard. Open sky, open air, no ceiling between the moment and the world. The pack gathered not because they were summoned, but because word travels in a pack the way water travels downhill, inevitably, quietly, finding every level. They came and stood in a loose circle, and the torches were lit, and the evening was cold and clear. Kale stood beside his father. He was still pale from the sickness, still moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that was healing, but his eyes were bright, and he was holding himself with a dignity that made him look older than 6. He had combed his hair, which Mara noticed and found so unexpectedly touching that she had to look away for a moment. Aldrich stood before the gathered pack, and he spoke without a prepared text because he didn't need one. He said that rank was a tool, that it existed to organize and protect, not to determine worth. That worth, real worth, was demonstrated, not inherited. He said that the Greylands had nearly lost its warden's son to a threat that none of its ranked wolves had identified, and had been saved by an unmarked woman with a herb satchel and 200 years of forgotten knowledge and the particular courage of someone who had never once been given a reason to care and cared anyway. He said that the pack he wanted to lead, the pack his mate had believed in, the pack he was choosing to build rather than simply inherit, did not waste people because of the rank they were born without. Then he turned to Mara. She stood at the edge of the torchlight. She had not dressed for ceremony because no one had told her there would be one. She was in her usual clothes, her satchel over her shoulder, her dark hair loose. She looked exactly like herself and nothing like what the moment probably called for, and she didn't care even slightly. "Mara," Aldrich said. His voice carried across the courtyard without effort. "You found my son when I couldn't protect him. You carried him when the law said you had no right to touch him. You sat with him in the dark and you stayed and you sang the old song and you gave him back to me." He paused. "I can't repay that. I'm not going to try." Another pause, shorter. "What I can do is make sure that this pack, my pack, knows exactly who you are and what you did and what you are owed." He stepped forward and pressed his forehead to hers. The courtyard went completely silent. It was the tethering, the oldest binding in Greyland tradition, older than rank designations, older than the warden title, older than almost everything except the Ashgall itself. Two foreheads touching. Two people breathing in sync. Not a mating claim, not a political transaction. Something more foundational than either. A declaration that said, "You are mine to protect, and I am yours to call upon, and no law and no rank and no distance will change that." They stood like that for a long moment. Mara felt the warmth of it, not just physical, though it was that too, his forehead solid and real against hers, but the warmth of being seen. Fully, completely, without condition. The warmth of a life spent invisible finally being looked at directly. She breathed in. She breathed out. When they separated, Aldrich looked at her with an expression she finally had a name for. It wasn't gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It wasn't grief, though it contained that too. It was the look of a man who had sealed himself shut 2 years ago and had spent 5 days watching a woman live so fully and so fearlessly that the walls he'd built had simply become irrelevant. It was the look of someone beginning. "Welcome to the Voss pack," he said quietly. Just for her. Kale appeared between them from nowhere in the way that children appear, suddenly, completely, with total disregard for the gravity of the adult moment he was interrupting. He grabbed Mara's hand with both of his and looked up at her with the unself-conscious joy of a child who has gotten exactly what he wanted and sees no reason to be subtle about it. "Does this mean you're staying?" he demanded. Mara looked down at him. She looked at his father. She looked at the gathered pack around them and the torchlight and the cold, clear sky above the courtyard, and she thought about the forest and the dead bird and the long night and the salt lick and the tribunal and Sable's open face and Rauna's ancient eyes and all of it leading here, to this boy's hands around hers and this question hanging in the cold evening air. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Kale threw both arms around her waist with a force that nearly knocked her sideways. She caught her balance and put one hand on the back of his head and held him there and looked at Aldrich over the top of his son's hair. He was watching her with that new expression, the one she had a name for now. And for the first time since she'd found him in the healer's room, he looked like a man who wasn't only holding himself together. He looked like a man who was being held. Months passed. The Greylands healed the way places heal, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small accumulations. A salt lick made safe. A pup recovering. A ranked wolf learning an old song from an unmarked woman who sat with their dying mother through the night. A beta who stopped touching the blade at her hip when she passed certain people in hallways. Sable's mother died on a Tuesday before dawn, with the ashgall humming low in the room and her daughter's hand in hers. Sable cried once, briefly, in a corridor, and Mara happened to be passing and stopped and stood beside her without speaking and without leaving. After a while, Sable straightened, smoothed her jacket, and said, "Thank you." Mara said she wasn't alone. That was all. It was enough. Kale learned the name of every plant in the satchel. Then he started asking about the ones that weren't in it. He and Mara walked the forest edge every morning, the careful, deliberate walks of a body still regaining its strength, and she taught him everything she knew, not just the names, but the reasons, the connections, the way one thing related to another in the long chain of living systems. He was a remarkable student. He remembered everything, questioned everything, and had the particular quality of a child who would grow into someone the world wasn't entirely prepared for. One morning, Aldrich joined them. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared at the forest edge as they were leaving and fell into step beside Mara, and nobody said anything about it because nothing needed to be said. Kale glanced between the two of them with the bright-eyed assessment of a child cataloging information he would definitely use later, and then pointed at a plant and asked what it was called, and Mara told him, and the three of them walked on into the morning. The last day of autumn, Mara stood at the forest edge alone, just before dusk, looking at the place where she had found Kale. The oak was still there, wide and solid and indifferent to the season. The ground beneath it was covered in fallen leaves. There was no trace of what had happened there: the fear, the small shaking boy, the dead bird held carefully in cupped hands. She reached into her satchel. She took out the square of cloth. She unfolded it slowly. Ash was still there, small and still and perfect, the way preserved things are perfect. She had kept him without entirely deciding to, the way you keep the things that mark the moments your life turned. She stood with him in her palm for a moment. Then she heard a sound, a single clear note, from somewhere in the branches above her. She looked up. A bird. Small, brown, impossible to distinguish from 100 other birds, except that it was there, in that tree, at that moment, looking down at her with the bright, unconcerned eyes of something that had survived a season it wasn't supposed to survive. It sang once more. Then it was gone. Mara stood in the last of the autumn light and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was held. She folded the cloth back over Ash carefully, the way she always had, and put him back in the satchel and turned toward home. Behind her, the oak stood silent in the darkening forest, keeping whatever it knew to itself, the way old things do. She walked back toward the lights of the settlement. Toward Kale's voice carrying across the courtyard, asking his father something she couldn't hear yet. Toward Aldrich's answer, low and unhurried. Toward the smell of cook fires and the sound of the pack settling into evening. She walked toward it like someone who had always belonged there. Because now she did. Asterisk, they will tell you that rank is everything in the Greylands. That blood determines worth. That the Unmarked have nothing to offer. They were wrong about all of it. And one woman, one lost boy, and one dead bird